Welcome to Alaqa, a podcast about the relationships shaping systems, capital, and the climate transition. Today, we're happy to welcome Greg De Temmerman. Greg has about 20 years of experience spanning fusion and energy research, philanthropic funding, and climate solutions. Working at the intersection between science, innovation, and climate action, he's passionate about building systems that enable bold and transformative initiatives to thrive. Until October 2025, he was Deputy CEO and Chief Science Officer of the Quadrature Climate Foundation in London. He's currently advising philanthropists and entrepreneurs on high-impact projects. He's a published author and TED speaker. The key topics we covered with Greg were the importance of effective communication in climate and energy, funding, power dynamics, and what it really takes to scale climate innovation, philanthropy's role in systems change and infrastructure building, and finally, the messy middle of climate transition. Greg, welcome. Welcome to Alaqa.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
It's been a while since we met each other around an event on a very specific and acute topic. I don't know if you remember, Greg. It was a conference around the need to finance or to find new ways to finance deep tech, and more specifically, impactful deep tech when it comes to renewables and technologies to meet the massive challenge at hand that humanity has to tackle. And I really enjoyed the mix of both humility and width of knowledge and experience that you managed to bring on stage, and the variety of the audience that you managed to bring over. And from there, I feel we kind of walk, from a distance, but in a relatively similar direction. So I was super excited when you accepted to come on the show.
No, I'm glad. And I do remember the event, and it has been a while indeed. And indeed,
Yes.
our paths have evolved in parallel, which is quite funny.
Exactly. So, Greg, you lived many lives, and I feel some of our listeners would be interested to hear more about how you ended up being so involved in different capacities, by the way, into the work that you do. And I will leave you to describe the work that you do, because I wouldn't want to to summarize it or butcher it the first minute. So
I have had a bit of a long career. I started as a scientist. I actually studied nuclear fusion for about 15 years, and I went into science and fusion for actually a very simple thing, which is I wanted to have impact. I wanted to work on something which could make things better, which could solve a big problem. So if you remember 20 years ago, we were already talking about energy, much less about climate, but energy was still a very important topic. So I figured, yeah, that's a very big challenge. I think I can do something. It's fascinating also from a science point of view because it was at the interface between different fields. So I went into that. Had a pretty good and interesting career. Lived in a couple of countries, the US, the UK, the Netherlands for a few years. Then I got coordinating scientist role at the ITER program, which is the biggest scientific experiment right now in the world, about $30 billion of budget, probably going to be higher in the end. A massive project, 3,000 people working on site, about 10,000 people in the world. Did that for 7 years. It was great because you really contribute to something which is enormous. That's probably the biggest scientific challenge that humanity is trying to solve right now. But at the same time, I was getting more and more concerned about climate, and ITER is a very long-term, so fusion is a long-term project. I wanted to have a bit of a more direct impact. So I was starting to look around 2020 at what could I do? What are the skills I can actually apply in different things? So at the same time, I was doing a lot of kind of communication around climate, around energy. I wrote a book, and I decided in 2020 to basically shift everything. So I left research and I started a think tank, which is where we met, which is called Xenon Research, based in Paris, where we pivoted a couple of times, but we ended up looking at early stage climate technologies. And the reason for that was that climate was becoming a really big topic. There was a lot of money coming in 2021, 2022, especially in early stage tech. But my conclusion at that time was, it's great, a lot of money is needed, but people were not necessarily thinking about the ecosystem you need for those innovations to come. There was also, as usual, a lot of hype around certain technologies. There were a lot of things being said. So I was frustrated by the lack of proper communications, the lack of engagement with policymakers, and the kind of disparate ecosystem between investors, entrepreneurs, scientists, and how to actually make that forward. So great experience. I did that for about 3 years. And then at the beginning of 2023, I got called by the Quadrature Climate Foundation, which is probably the biggest philanthropic foundation for climate in the world right now, which funds projects which can actually have an impact in the world. It's a really big budget, 300 to 400 millions per year. I got hired as chief scientist, and I was in charge of revamping the strategy and trying to get some more impact with the money we were having. And I just finished my contract there, and I'm going to start something different in January, still on deep tech and climate, actually.
I love the way you frame a significant part of your work, the way you use the word communication. One of my best friends is a researcher, and she spends so much time communicating, conveying her ideas, receiving ideas, thinking about how ideas travel. So perhaps in the science world, it's so obvious that communication is a key factor in your work. But since our listeners are not necessarily from that field, can you elaborate a bit more on what role and what intention do you put when you think about communication, especially in your field, and especially when thinking about things so complex and so intertwined and sometimes difficult to grasp as the climate challenges at large?
I think in general, scientists are not necessarily very good at communications, and science as a field doesn't do so well. It's getting much better, but it's coming from a very long way. So I think it's fine that scientists are not all good communicators.
You mean communication to the general public?
Yeah, but also internally, people are used to talk to experts in their fields. We use a certain language. We use a lot of acronyms in a given field. We are not necessarily always incentivized to take a step back and try to get this bigger picture. Now, I'm kind of simplifying a bit because when you go to a funding agency and so on, you have to do part of that. But I think what is becoming more and more apparent is scientists need to be a bit more engaged in public efforts to actually communicate the science, but also the uncertainties around the science, what we know, what we don't know, being able to, in simple terms, explain very complicated things. And that's one of the things I always did in my career. I started late because, like many people, I thought my only role as a scientist was to do the science, to do the research. But then I started to realize that if you want to get to the extra mile, if you want to get more funding, you need to actually be able to make sure people understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because for me, when I have a science project, I always think, yeah, of course, we should do that. That's a good idea. That's mine. So we should do it. But then you have to start convincing people. You have to start competing with other people, usually for a low amount of money. So you have to develop that part. Now, coming to climate, I think climate is a very complicated field, but you can still explain it in very simple terms. And I think it's very important that we convey that complexity in terms of this is what we know, these are the unknowns, and these are the known and unknown unknowns, right? These are the things we don't know about, and we don't even know whether we'll know about them in the future. And I think it should be the kind of basis for decision making, especially when you talk about policies and so on. It's like, what do we know about what is going to happen? And then what can we do about it? And I think one of the reasons science has been so attacked in the past decade probably is because of the complexity and because it's hard to convey the uncertainties, what we call error bars, for example. We call that error bars in science. People would think there is an error. Why do I care? You don't know what you're talking about. But it's a very different thing. It's because those things are very complicated. We have to make some assumptions and so on. And those assumptions have to be communicated in a way where people understand the method. Science is all about asking questions and sometimes having answers, but then making sure that people see that there is some solid science behind. So we know that climate, for example, is caused by humans. There is no doubt about it. We have some doubts about what is going to happen in the future because there are a lot of variables. But we know who is responsible and we know generally what the solutions are.
Okay, my next question for you around this general topic of communication, which is, if you simplify it to contact between ideas and between individuals, what is the relationship or relationships, perhaps with groups of people, not necessarily one person, that shaped how you've been thinking over time, not just now, but really thinking over time about the idea of funding, not only capital as in for businesses, but you said so funding and research is absolutely a critical topic. So how it shaped your view of funding and finance and access to capital, and what can you tell us about it?
I think when I left research, I probably thought I knew more than I did, in the sense that you get into a field, you get an expert into it, and then you see everything with the lens that you are using every day, right? I was seeing things as a scientist, working on energy. And some things, when you talk about physics, are obvious,
Hmm.
but then you have to start looking at the complexity of the ecosystem. So when I left and when we started Xenon and we started to talk to so many people from investors, entrepreneurs, and so on, it was very interesting to start understanding that there are so many great ideas in the world, but they don't necessarily go anywhere for many reasons, and they die at different stages. Investors are not all people who are greedy for money, right? They want to have some impact, and especially in the climate space, a lot of people really try to get impact, but they have to have a fun and have some return. So I think it's a growing network of relationships and complexities which help me understand how does it take to change the system? And I'm not necessarily claiming I know how to do it. I'm still learning. I start to see how the different pieces of the puzzle fit together. What is the role of regulations? What is the role of policymakers? What is the role of investors? And then what are the gaps in the ecosystem where probably you can go into? And then it's all about meeting people who are willing to spend some time with you to talk about that and explain to you what it is, what they are doing, what they see in the system. So it's basically this kind of growing network as you learn into a new domain, which was a new domain for me. Is like finding the people who are willing to spend some time with you, explaining that. Many people would ask me questions about energy, which is the field I know most about.
For sure.
And then I'll spend a lot of time talking about it because I love it. Yeah, how do you get the people to share their knowledge, but also their failure? What I found really interesting in the last 5 years is learning about what doesn't work, because it's where you can see, okay,
That's your researcher bias
no,
to
exactly.
learn from failed experiments.
No, exactly. I think it
Yeah.
is. And it is very important because we tend to put, even in science, actually, we tend to put failure below the carpet because people don't retribute failure, right? It's seen as a negative thing in science. And obviously in climate, it's also not a positive thing because you're losing time. But if we can understand better what's working, what's not working, then hopefully at some point we can get faster to deploy the solutions we need.
And so when you were at Quadrature Foundation, how did it change your perspective on funding allocation, grants, or investments? Because I understand you had a global vantage point and a global exposure to climate projects. How did it shift from being on the receiver end to the highly influencing the people writing the checks?
I'll start by that point because that's very important. I think what took me a little while to understand is the power dynamics. When you're a funder, whatever you say, whatever you do, money has power, right? So it took me quite a while to realize that as soon as you have a big checkbook, anything you say, anything you do has an influence on the people you talk to and who wants the money, right? So if people need funding, and if you start throwing ideas at them and you just think you're in a conversation, in many cases that influences what they are saying and what they are going to do. And you have to be really aware of that because in many cases, again, my science background is like I ask questions, I suggest ideas and so on, but I don't necessarily think they are good. I'm just testing and hoping for something to come back.
No.
When you are a funder and when you discuss with a potential partner, then it can create an imbalance where people think this is what I need to do to get the money.
Yeah, it can seem as prescriptive.
Exactly. And it is a really weird thing to live with because it's great to be able to fund projects, but I don't want to influence people. I want to also understand what they need. The other thing which is extremely important as a funder is asking the right questions, right? I think in many cases, people come to you with a proposal because they see what your budget is, they know how much money they need, and they see how much money they can ask you and think they have a reasonable chance. So it's pretty rare that people ask you what they really need. What people tend to do is, I'm going to ask what I think I can get out of that foundation, which of course makes sense because they want to maximize their chance of having funding. And then it took us a bit of time at the foundation, but at some point we really started to question people of, is it really what you need? Don't you think you also need a back office, for example? Don't you need some kind of core support to just pay your electricity bills, your rent, and so on? And then suddenly the discussion changes because people realize that you understand what their constraints are. And I think that is a very important lesson is people are, of course, trying to get projects, trying to get money. At the end of the day, especially in the NGO space, keeping people, making sure you give them a bit of stability in terms of jobs and so on is really important.
Yeah, beyond the strictly funding the project, but also funding the overheads and the skills and the infrastructure that is needed to keep the company or the NGO moving and building in a safe and non-predatory way for its own employees and its own ecosystem.
It is the kind of less sexy thing, right? Many foundations don't do that because they think it is true that it's harder to measure your impact if you're funding the infrastructure because You're allowing the system, you're enabling the system, but you can't really pinpoint this is what I funded and what I did, and this is what the money has done. So I think you have to be able to take a step back and understand that your impact is going to be harder to measure. And that's the second big thing I learned is we did a lot of work on contribution and attribution, trying to get our impact framework and trying to see what can we actually measure about where the money is going, because that money obviously is a lot. Our funders needed to see the impact, but we really took them on a journey to say, look, we can tell you what you contributed to, but we are never going to tell you this is because of you or because of your money that things have happened. It was a tough discussion with our board because this is not the way necessarily everybody is thinking, especially we were funded by a hedge fund, which is really hard quantitative people used to have a lot of dashboards, a lot of data and so on. And we're telling them you have to take a step back and you have to just see the system. You have to look at the signals of change. What you can see is whether you are contributing to the right direction or not, but we are not going to tell you your dollar has done that exactly. I mean, in some cases, of course, we have created a new organization. You can say this is because of you, but the impact is usually quite soft. And then the last thing I learned is, again, the importance of the ecosystem. I met so many great and motivated people. First of all, it gave me a lot more optimism than I had when I started, because climate is hard.
Because you started depressed? I love that. But I went, nevertheless, I went to fight.
Yeah, not necessarily depressed. When you work on climate or environment, it's easy to get bogged down by the negatives.
Absolutely.
And then you start to see all those people who are really try hard, have great ideas and are trying, are creating something, are trying to get the system to change and so on. And I think it's an immense lesson of optimism and hope, because if people are actually willing to do that, to sometimes sacrifice a really high paying job to do something different and so on, I think there's something about being inspired by that. And then you start to understand how the people try to work together, and how an NGO is actually fundamental for change to happen, because they do advocacy, they do that, they do campaigning. And you start to see how the system needs all of that to actually try and move forward. And you start to see change also on the ground. We have seen in the last 10 years some things changing in the right direction on climate. It's not going fast enough, but things are still happening. It's also great to meet those people and to be able to enable them with a check in many cases, or relationships, coming back to your previous questions. As a funder, one thing you can also do for your partners is put them in contact with other people and try to increase the level of connectivity into a system.
Do you know, when you were talking about the discussions on attribution or contribution, this is a fascinating topic, because as in impact investing or in impact activities at large, there is a growing will to understand what is the best direction to put your money, limited by money, by design, and to craft the most effective theory of change, to understand and to ask for all sorts of KPIs, and understanding how these activities are going to produce that effects and your assumptions on the effects, and then monitoring the said effects and hoping that the outcomes will be aligned with what you were envisaging at the beginning, all that jazz. And when you mentioned your board and their practices of having dashboards, theory of change also can be shared through a dashboard. But I would love for our listeners to hear more about how you conveyed, in simpler terms or as simple as possible, the difference between having a linear view, a linear approach, a mechanical nearly approach of, okay, I invested X, this company managed to invest Y, and therefore they recruited Z, and they managed to trigger this extra income, and therefore this cash flow, and it's great return on investment, versus contributing to enabling change conditions, pushing on a lever of change and hoping that it will move, and observing what's going on and listening to whatever changed and reacting again. How do you convey such a, it's not difficult, but it's a totally different mindset and framework and heuristic, essentially, of looking at the world and looking at the consequences of your actions. How did you do that with your board? If you could share, without names, how you managed to tell that story, really.
It's a great question. And it was not a linear process. Obviously, there were a lot of back and forth. The first thing we did was to make sure that we were humble and honest with them, which is, even if the foundation is a big funder, it's a drop in the ocean, right? 400 million per year is a lot of money, but at the same time, it's nothing compared to what the world needs to transition. So it's this realization that it's great that you're giving so much money, but it's only going to do something. And the thing is, how do we get that money to be as catalytic as possible? This is philanthropic capital, which means you don't expect a financial return. How do we get an impact return, but how do we get that impact on the long term? So I think the first discussion was, are you in for the short term or are you in for the long term? They agreed that long term was what they wanted to do. And that's where you can start engaging the discussion, saying on the long term, you're not going to see results in the next 2 to 3 years. And you might actually see a lot of things in the world going backwards, and you're still going to provide money on the ecosystem, in the infrastructure. And then also, once you start thinking long term, you start to think about the importance of the infrastructure, because it's not only about the next shiny thing, which philanthropy does like. I mean, you see a lot of philanthropic action with really things that people get excited about, and it's great. That's one model. We were going in for the long run. What are the things we think are needed for transformation in the next 10, 15 years? And that means funding things on the long run, giving longer grants, giving more flexibility to people to be nimble. The advantage we had is our board came from a kind of startup world. They had started a hedge fund like 10 years ago. They knew what a startup was. They knew the importance of being flexible, nimble, and so on. So we could use that to tell them this is going to be the same thing, right? People have an idea, they want to work on it, but you need to give them the chance to pivot whenever it's needed, to change stance, to actually evolve in their strategy. We also spend a lot of time trying to do our own theory of change as a foundation. And that's where also we realize, as you said, that you can spend 2 years devising what your strategy will be and what your theory of change is, put your assumptions. And in a way, you learn a lot. It's great. But the reality is that during the time you do that, first of all, the money is needed in the field. So any dollar you don't give is a dollar which is going to be missing in an ecosystem which is underfunded. And the other thing is, and especially in the last few years, the world is changing really quickly. So if you spend too much time trying to have a good theory, you're actually missing on it because you're not acting on it. So it's interesting to place yourself into the system and seeing what are the leverage points you want to act on, but also using that money to be experimental and see what you can do without being too theoretical. It's like, just get going, right? Fun things, see how things are going, learn from it, and allow for things to emerge as you are doing that. And I think once we made that whole story, they really understood that this is probably the best way for them to do. Now, obviously, sometimes there were some back and forth discussion about, I want to fund that, what do you think, and so on. But I think we went from, in 3 years, probably a pretty tech-heavy foundation to a more infrastructure foundation, which is looking at the base of the system.
Can you give us an example of what you call infrastructure in this case?
It's looking at things like regranters, for example. So many foundations are funding what we call regranters, which are entities like the European Climate Foundation and so on, which are specialized, which are more localized in a country, which have more links. And it's basically enabling those actors to have enough core funding so that they can explore, they can spend time understanding what is going on in a country and so on. So you're not funding specific projects, but you're funding those people to actually just get the time to think and act. It's also sometimes creating new NGOs or supporting researchers or whatever basically you think can be needed to get an impact. And in many cases, it's about also funding a lot of advocacy. So think tanks or people who are actually spending time with people, with policymakers, for example, explaining topics to them, talking to financiers, talking to investors about this is what is going on. So it's enabling also convenings. It's extremely important to be able to allow people to convene. Sometimes just funding people to go to COP, for example, right? Allowing them to use that money to go to COP, which is really expensive because that's a very interesting forum. It's also sometimes about financing databases, things that people need, tools that are going to be helping the ecosystem. So we funded a lot of think tanks and NGOs which were collecting data on the energy transition, making that data easy to use, easy to visualize, measuring finance flows and so on, things that then people can use to build action. But this is a layer of funding which, it does produce great graphs, but it's not what is going to change the system. Is how do you provide all of those data, all of this information for other people to actually act on them?
No, I understand. Next part of the conversation is about the lessons and the tensions that relationship inevitably creates. Huh? It can be a positive thing to have a tension. It means that parties are dynamic. So what's one challenge you faced navigating complexity through relationships, and how did you work through it? So beyond the misunderstanding of a mechanistic versus systems approach with your work.
I would say the biggest one is probably the realization that in a way nobody knows what to do. I mean, no, but I'm going to, I'm qualifying that statement. But
Greg, I love that statement. This is 100% a researcher statement. Like, we know that we don't know. We know so much, but we know so much that we
exactly.
don't know so much more.
But what I was trying to say is we don't have a playbook. We don't have a full
Mm,
playbook to actually transform the system.
of
Everybody
course.
has ideas, and we all have things. And obviously, people know a lot. But I think the reality of it is systems change is really complicated. It's really
Mm,
context specific. So I think I had quite a few interesting discussions over the years with that, like making sure people admit that. And it's not a failure, right? It's not a weakness. It's just the reality is we are trying things and we are learning from it, but we don't know exactly how the system will change and will react. And as a US president is being elected, and then suddenly everything comes back. And I think that's a tension in the system which I don't think we are spending enough time on, especially in climate. We tend to think everybody agrees and wants the same thing, but it's actually not true. So, to give you a concrete example, when I started in philanthropy, there are meetings with the big foundations exchanging what they are doing, their strategies, and so on. And I initially thought we all work on climate, so we all have the same kind of theory of change in a way. But then I started realizing, and that was a pretty naive thing of me to think of, but then I started to realize it's not true. People have different views of whether capitalism is the right thing to do, whether you want to work on demand side, on supply side, whether people think what are the role of technologies and so on. And in a way, that's normal, but that kind of tells you already that this is a system with probably different solutions. There are probably different ways to solve the problem or to change the system. And at the end of the day, it's a kind of vision towards what are we going towards, what is the society we want to have in the future. And I don't think we necessarily spend enough time on that. And I'm not saying that we should just be debating about those things forever and having philosophical discussions, but understanding where people agree and where people don't agree is very important to actually see where we can actually induce change on the short term and where can things happen in the longer term.
No, for sure. There's a political element and a political science element to this discussion, which remains invisible until it collides with a fundamental way of either giving access to capital or even thinking about the concept of return to money invested and so on and so forth. Absolutely. I would love for you to share with us one contrarian thought. So that's the moment where you would leave a statement that will be commented by further guests, creating a chain and therefore promoting conversations. So either a hot take or something that people should do less, in your opinion, or something that you keep on debating with people over and over again.
Yeah, and that's also something I'm debating with myself. But I think I'll go for. I think the arc of progress is not dead. I think we can still
Mm.
design a future which is better than the present. It's going to be different. Some things will be worse, but I think overall we still have the ways to and the means to make the future better. Obviously, climate is a really hard problem, and it's not the only one we have to solve. But there are so many people in the world who don't have access to electricity, energy, and so on. And I think we can still design a future where those people get out of poverty, energy poverty at least, and get a decent life. It's not going to be easy, but I think we also need to think again about progress. This word has been forgotten in the recent past. I think humanity can still progress in terms of how we improve health, how we improve living conditions for people, and so on.
And what is the type of pushback that the people from NGOs or fellow practitioners or fellow foundation participants share with you when you give this statement?
For an interesting reason, which I don't fully understand, whenever you talk about progress, people think technology quite easily. And obviously, the two are interlinked, right? The reasons we have a better health system is because we have had so much progress on the science and technology side. But I think we can also decouple them. It's what are the things we want to improve in life? And they don't necessarily all need high-tech things. They just need us to focus on that. One concrete example, I just finished a book called Abundance, which came out, I think, at the beginning of the year, which I think is very interesting because it makes the argument that we live in a world where there's a scarcity of common goods, accommodations like hospitals, like healthcare, and we have an abundance of goods which probably sometimes don't bring so much to us, like gadgets and so on. So I think there's an interesting dynamic about what is it that we want in abundance. We probably want accommodation, flats, houses where people can actually live decently. We want a really good education system and so on. We can probably do less with something. So it's what are you putting the cursor on and where do you think you should prioritize efforts to make things better overall.
Next up, your go-to person. So since we're talking about relationships, it would be nice to have a shout-out moment. So your go-to person when thinking about changing the system or systems.
I'm going to give a shout out to somebody I'm working with on a new project right now, Julie Gonzalez, who you should meet. Probably you know her actually, who has a very different background from mine. And we are trying to work on how do we get more new ideas into the world? How do we get people, especially scientists, more ambitious about systems change and how to actually take more risk? And she brings a very different view from mine in terms of where she comes from and how does she approach problems. So that's probably going to be my big shout out right now. And she's also great to work with.
Excellent. And now it's the time for the flash round. So it's big questions and short answers. Okay? First, a question you wish more investors would ask.
What do you need? What do you really need?
But how can they go, like realistically, beyond the political dynamic, beyond the power dynamic that you mentioned very acutely earlier? How do you create this safe space or this shared goal of actually wanting to understand what do people really need? How do you do that?
I'm not sure I know exactly the solution. I think the way we did it was to say, look, we are going to separate the funding discussion to what else we can bring to you, right? We are going to fund you. We are going to provide some money. We have limitations on what we can do. But obviously, as a philanthropic foundation, we had more flexibility than a pure investor in how we were organizing our money. But if you say, look, I care about your project, not only because I think there are returns, but because I think it's a cool thing, I want to help you. What else do you need? Is that, can I get you a board member? Can I help you shape your board so that it's not a power dynamics place? So it's not a place where people try to influence you, but it's a place where people can help you. And it's also giving them the space to challenge and say, I think this is not what I really need, or you're putting too much constraints on me and so on. So I think you have to create the space, but also show that you are in for something else than the money. And then you can bring, I don't know, a connection. You can bring just a tip. You can say, oh, I talked to that person the other day. You might want to talk to. So it's what else than the pure financial argument can you bring to the table? And obviously, I know it's a bit of a dream world because an investor has a mission, they are here for something and they are doing a great job. But in many cases, they see so many people. They can also just share lessons. Somebody tried to do that a couple of years ago, didn't work for that and that reason. Just that is a very valuable thing for somebody trying to get a project off the ground.
One book, music, or practice that helps you to hold complexity.
Practices, I do run a lot. That does create some space for me to just think. In terms of book, I already gave it because that's the book I just finished, which is Abundance. I mean, one practice that I use a lot is I read things that I don't agree with. So I force myself to read things that I know I'm not going to agree with, but I just want to see where people come from, what arguments are they putting forward, and try to understand it. And sometimes it does change the way I see things anyway, because they might have some very good arguments. So I'm always trying to see, what are people using as arguments to perhaps oppose an argument that I'm making? It does require a bit of patience because sometimes it makes you cringe. You want to throw the book away. But in many cases, it is instructive. And obviously, there are some limits. I'm not going to read a full book about somebody saying climate change doesn't exist. Right? I want to understand some of the arguments, but there are some limits. But I think getting that nuance, trying to understand where other people come from is very useful to me.
Do you do that from people who come from different geographies? Because we didn't necessarily mention it, but there's a lot of discussion of another power dynamic, which is where the money comes from and where it's supposed to go and who has it and for what reasons, and notably historic reasons and economic systems reasons. I know science is an international endeavor, of course. Do you tend to reflect or to open yourself to people or practices or perspectives or innovations from other geographies intentionally, or it just happens and you don't see that much of a difference anyway?
Not only geographies, but also cultural differences. So one thing I did over the past year was to try and get to, because you mentioned science is international, it is true, but science is also, at least research, because science is something, but research is quite technocratic in a way. And there are a lot of discussions right now about how do you reconcile kind of top-down science with more bottom-up approaches, so indigenous knowledge. How do you actually use the knowledge that communities have accumulated over a long time in different ways? And how do you try to join different things? So that's something I spent quite some time on, which is a fascinating topic because, again, I come from the more kind of top-down world. And you realize, obviously, that there is a lot of knowledge which is out there. One concrete example, when we did a project 2 years ago on mining and critical minerals, I discovered something that I didn't know, which is a lot of communities actually have developed techniques to understand where metals are going to be. So we talk a lot about artisanal mining, and obviously in many cases it's done in really poor conditions. But those people actually have an incredible knowledge about where they live and where they have found metals and how do we actually find them. And we're looking at how do we value that? How do we get mining companies to actually value that knowledge, which is incredible? And the question is how you do that without having a big mining company come and just fire all those people away. So I think it's interesting to see that, yeah, there's so much knowledge which is much less technical that we are used to in the global north, which is really worth listening to and also worth integrating when we take decision. The other one, which was an eye-opener, was we funded a really cool project to create a virtual institute for systems change in Africa, where the prime thesis is to get the systems to change in African countries, you need to have context. You need to take into account the local context. And most of the energy modeling done for Africa is usually done in Europe or in the US. And people don't understand the context they are all going to operate in. So what are the kind of economical constraints? What are the tensions between the resources which exist in a country and people wanting to actually use that because they know how to do that and so on. So I think that part also is like, how do you get different approaches joined together so that you basically make science something that people can really use for decisions, and that requires to actually go there and have a very open mind about what are the questions people are really asking. They're not less smart than you are, they're not less intelligent, they're not less capable, it's just that they don't have the same tools, but they don't have the same lived experience also. And this is quite interesting to try and listen to that and see where things are coming.
Is it part of what you called infrastructure building earlier?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. Quite a few projects we funded were about trying to increase science capacities in Africa. And the reason is, first of all, it's great if you have more scientists from Africa. If you look at the number of IPCC researchers which come from Africa, it's really small. And it's Africa, but it's also other underdeveloped countries, obviously, yes. The question is, who is going to do and fund some things which are about building capacity? So getting people trained, even at different levels, from scientists to policymakers, so that they actually get some more technical knowledge. You can get in with consultants and try to help, but that's probably not sustainable. What you want is the country to actually build capacity and be able to reproduce that capacity on the way. And that's infrastructure. That's providing the means, the structures to actually ensure that those things can be done, and obviously the money for things to happen. And you have to think about the full chain from the science to the decision making and what tools people need on the way to actually get there.
A system you'd love to see more love for or more disruption in?
I would say circularity, so material circularity, but in the sense of how do we not only think about recycling, but think about the full life cycle. So when we design something, how do we make it easier to repair, to reuse, to change? When we design a material, how do we make it easier to recycle? So how do we start thinking about engineering in a more circular way?
The definition of cool, you used the word cool several times. How would you think about coolness when it comes to circularity, for instance, material circularity?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I always try to see what are the opportunities in things, right? We have a lot of challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities. And I think circularity, scientifically speaking, is a very interesting challenge. And so it's about how do you get people curious about a challenge. So your challenge is to make things more reusable or more circular, but you want to do it from the full chain. Again, it's not only about building something and trying to recycle it the hard way. So it's getting people intellectually stimulated by the idea of creating something more circular, and not only being stimulated by the impact of being more circular, but by the thought process of what if.
The intellectual challenge by itself.
Exactly. What kind of scientific breakthroughs or technology breakthroughs would allow us to have actually be much more circular? What does it mean? What does it need to happen? What kind of fields in science do we need to make work together? Yeah, intellectually really stimulating. In all the big challenges we face today, they are hard and they are going to take a lot of resources to be solved. But there's something about, yeah, we are smart as a species. We're also stupid in many cases. But when we put our brains together, we can actually unlock a lot of things. So how do we get that feeling about, yeah, we are actually trying to solve things for the common good?
And final question, what gives you hope in the capital/climate space right now?
It's going to sound a bit paradoxical with what I said earlier, but I think the interesting thing I see is that things are becoming economically attractive. People can make money out of climate solutions. We are starting to see some people making money, some funds returning money, and so on, which means people are not going into climate solutions only for climate, but also because they see that there is an economic interest into it. And in many cases, climate solutions are becoming economically more attractive than the incumbent solution. And that's great because that means there is no reason to do a fossil fuel solution if you can do something cheaper with something else. So I think the fact that the economics of the systems are evolving, we can criticize the whole economic system, but we know that once people see an economic interest of if something is more efficient or cheaper, then people will choose that rather than choosing another solution. That part to me is quite exciting, and it's making me optimistic that some more money can come, some more solutions can scale in the future.
But why what you're saying is paradoxical from what you were saying?
Because I was trying to explain earlier that you have to try and change the whole system and you have to look at different aspects. But we also know that economics drive everything in many cases. And the fact that the economics are starting to be in our favor, I think is a big sign that the system is ready to change on some aspects, not everything.
And what about the pace of this change?
It's slow, but accelerating. I think we see some fundamentals changing again in the economics. Even with Trump being against climate in many countries looking at what they should be doing, we see things happening on the ground. We see even countries in Africa are now going for renewables because it's cheaper than just trying to invest in gas. So I think we are in this phase where if you look at an S-curve, things are going to accelerate. It's not going fast enough. And the big issue we have right now is because we haven't been fast enough, we are going to suffer consequences. And I think that's something where people are going to have to get those two views together, which is things are changing on one side for the better because we are making progress, but they're also going to change on the wrong side because climate is going to continue changing for a while. That is going to be an interesting thing to navigate, but it's not going fast enough, unfortunately. Some things are accelerating. We need much more than that, but we also know it's incredibly hard. And perhaps the last thing I'll say is I think we as a climate community, we probably have underestimated the difficulty of the challenge.
Of taking action, you mean? Or the challenge of the technological and the behavioral challenge?
So the energy transition is about changing the whole energy system. It's complicated. It's going to be really hard. And I think we have under-communicated on that. We want, of course, to accelerate change and so on. But I think we need now a discussion about the messy middle. Things are going to be difficult, and that's the way it is going to be. We can't change a full system in 10 years, even if we want to, because there is too much resistance into the system. And we have to have this honesty at some point to say, yeah, it is going to be difficult, and that's the only thing we can do is push forward, because otherwise things are going to get even worse.
I have to say, I really appreciate, Greg's, your LinkedIn posts, which are always very informative, very well documented. And I think you already mentioned several times this question of pace and the need to step up and need to experiment more things at the same time to collect data and lessons and make better decisions as soon as possible. So thank you for this effort for the people who read you, because please know that, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, who reads you with much interest and trust in what you share. So
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation, Greg. Thank you for listening to Alaqa. If this conversation sparked something for you, share it, leave a review, and subscribe for more dialogues at the intersection of capital, systems, and transformation.